Begin today the Gemara on Daf Chavav Amud Beis, Omar Ula, 10 lines up from the bottom of the Yamud. The Gemara here is continuing from what it spoke about before, a person that's planting a tree near his friend's property. And the Mishnah says that you have to distance your tree because the roots extend into his property and it could ruin his property. So here, in relation to this, the Gemara brings how this applies regarding the mitzvah of Bikurim in Eretz Yisrael. Omar Ula said, Elon hasamach lemetzar. If you have a tree in your property, but it's near the border of your friend's property, b'toich sheish esrei amma, and it's closer than 16 amas into your friend's property, gazlanhu. So then you're stealing the roots that are extending into your friend's property, and they're taking nourishment from his earth. So you're stealing from him, and therefore ve'eim mevi'in mimenu bikurim. So from this tree you can't bring bikurim. You can't do the mitzvah of bikurim. Why not? So Rashi's opinion is because in the pasuk when it says the mitzvah of bikurim, it says asher tovi ma'artzecha, that the bikurim have to be brought from your land. It has to be yours. Over here, it's taking nourishment from your friend. Tosfos brings a pshat from Rabbeinu Hananel that the reason is because any gzela cannot be brought as any kind of carbon. The bikurim that are brought in the Beis HaMikdash, because there's an aspect of gzela here, so it can't be brought as a carbon or as bikurim. How does Ula know this? Basically, what the Gemara understands right now is Ula is saying that every tree takes nourishment with the roots 16 amas all around and around, which means that you have the tree in the center, and on each side of the tree you have the roots extending 16 amas. So that what that basically means is, before we see the Gemara here, there's going to be a little bit of math over here in the Gemara. What that basically means is that you have a square that's 32 amas by 32 amas. 16 amas on each side, to the left, to the right, and in all sides, it's 16 by amas that it extends, so that's 32 by 32 amas. How many square amas is that going to be? It's 1,024. 32 times 32 is 1,024. That's the number of amas that there are here that the tree, that the nourishment of the roots extend to. That's what Ula is saying. So here the Gemara wants to know, what was the source of Ula to say that the roots extend to that far? So now, if you're going to say meditnan, that it's based on what it says in the Mishnah. This is a Mishnah in Masechta Shvius. So now, the basis of that Mishnah is the halacha that you have to stop doing any work in your field, not only from the beginning of Shemitah, which is Rosh Hashanah, but already from Pesach. It's learned from Sukkim that Erev Shemitah, you're not allowed to do work in your field. Okay, but there, though, the Mishnah says there's exceptions to this. There's a halacha l'Moshe Sinai that in certain cases you're allowed to do work in your field all the way up to Rosh Hashanah, or at least till Shavuos. So there the Mishnah says as follows: if you have 10 little plantings, 10 little trees that are spread out in a beisa, you're allowed to continue plowing this field with these trees. And it means you're allowed to plow anywhere in the area of this Beisa, all the way up to Rosh Hashanah, and you don't have the usual limitation of Shavuos or even Pesach before that. Okay, so now here, what do we see? What it's saying is that when you have these trees that are spread out in this area of the Beisa, then the entire Beisa is considered to be an area that has trees in it, because you have the roots of the trees that are spreading out in the entire Beisa, so you can be plowing in the entire Beisa for the benefit of these trees, so these trees shouldn't die. So what's the size of a beisa? A beisa is 50 by 50 amas. So if you have 10 trees that are in each beisa, what does it come out to? So now, kama havuluhu, what is the square amas of 50 by 50, which is what a beisa is? That's trei alfen v'chamish mea garmidi. That's 2,500 amas. That's how many square amas you have in 50 by 50. So if you have 10 trees that are spread out equally in an area of 2,500 amas, that means l'chochad v'chad kama matile. How much area is there for each tree that you're saying that its roots spread out into that area? That's masan v'chamshin. That's 250. Again, if the total area is 2,500, so 10 trees in that area means that each tree gets 200 and 500 and 250, that is amas, of where the roots spread out. So the question is, Holei Aved Ola. This is not like what Ola said. It's much less than what Ola said. Right? Ola said that the trees spread out and each tree gets 1,024 amas is the square footage of the 32 by 32 amas. And over here it says much less. It says 200 and 250. So therefore the Gemara brings that the source of what all is said is from a different Mishnah. The Mishnah says in Masechta Shvius, Shloisha Ilonis. Here it's not talking about netiyas. Netiyas are saplings. So their roots are much smaller and they take nourishment of the ground much less. Here we're talking about trees. So 3 trees, Shal Gimel B'nei Adam, that are owned by 3 people. And you have these 3 trees that are lined up equally and they're spread out equally in the same besa, the same size, the area that we were talking about before, 50 by 50 ames. Harei elu mitztarfin. So we combine the roots that spread out from these 3 trees that are extended equally in this area, and you can plow the entire area. Now over here the Bach adds that's adatzeres, not like before it said until Rosh Hashanah, which are new trees, saplings, but over here with these trees that are bigger trees already, you could only do the plowing in them only until Shavuos in the year before Shemitah. Okay, but the point here is, here we see that when you have 3 trees in this area of 50 saw, that you're able to plow the entire area because the roots spread out all over. So now what's the cheshbon here? Kama avalohos, as we said before, what's the square ames of 50 by 50, the saw? That's 3 alpha v'hei mea garmidi. It's 2,500 ames. So now if you divide 2,500 ames for 3 trees, l'chochad kama mati, what does that mean? How much does each tree, the roots extend? Motile, that's Tmani Meya Tlossen Vitlosa Vitilsa. That's 833 and a third. That's how much it's when you divide 2,500, that's what it comes to. So that means that each tree, the roots extend 833.3. So the question is, Akati Nifishile Dola. The amount that Ola says that each tree, the roots extend is still more. The number that Ola said is, it extends to each side 16 amas, so that's 32 by 32, which comes out to be 1024, not 833.3. So why is Ola saying that the roots extend even further? So the Gemara says, Loi dok. Ola was not very, very specific. Ola said a number which is more than what we see from the Mishnah, but he wasn't specific. The truth is that the roots extend less. Okay, so the Gemara says, how could you say he wasn't medayik? When can we say such a thing that Ula is saying something different than the Mishnah and he's not being precise? That's if what he's saying, not being precise, would be stringency. But would Ula add a number that's larger than the Mishnah, which would come out to be a kula? That's what Ula is basically saying here, because by adding a larger number, what he's saying is, as long as your tree extends into your neighbor's property with this larger amount, you're going to be potter from bringing bikurim. So by giving this larger shear, it ends up being a leniency. Okay, so therefore the Gemara says, we must add a different point here. When Ula gave the shear that a tree extends 16 amas to each side, our assumption to this up until this point was that this is a square. It's a square of 32 by 32 amas, and therefore 32 times 32 is 1024. So that's much more of 833.3. So therefore the Gemara says, Mi savres biribua kamrinan. Do you think that Ula, when he gave the shear that the roots of the tree extend 16 amas to each side, he was talking about a square? No, it's not a square. Bi gula kamrinan. What he meant to say is, it's a circle. It's 16 amas on each side, but it's in a circle though. And therefore you have to deduct all the corners that there are in a square more than the circle. So mechti, so let's see, kama merube yaiser ala igol. How much is a square more than a circle because of the corners that you have? Rivia, it's a quarter more. Or in other words, a circle that's inside a square is only 3/4 of the square. So if so, the shear that we had before, which is 1024, and you want to take off a quarter of that, how much is it going to be? Pashuluhu, the remainder that you'll have is for 16 amas that it goes on each side, but not the square of 1024, but you have to deduct a third from that. What is it going to be? Zayin Meya V'Shitn Itmanya. It's going to be 768. That's the amount of the nourishment of the roots that extend according to Ola. So now it comes out that what was the shear we had before? That it said based on the Mishnah that the shear was 833.3. That's how much the roots extend. Over here, what's the shear that Ola is saying? That the roots extend around, and the shear is 768. So now it comes out now that Ula is saying a shear of how far the roots extend less than what the Mishnah said. So now the Gemara spells this out. The Gemara explains, so akati pashle palgedamse. But if so, it still comes out that there's a difference between what Ula said and what we could learn from the Mishnah, a half a amma. And what that means is, what's the difference between the amount that Ula said and the amount that we could see from the Mishnah? The amount that Ula is 768. The amount that you learn from the Mishnah is 833. And that's a difference of 65 square amas. So in order to make up for that difference of 65 square amas, you have to add a half a amma on every side. So Ula says that it's 16 amas that the roots extend on every side. According to what it says in the Mishnah, it's going to have to be 16 and a half amas on one side and 16 and a half amas on the other side. When you had a half a amma on each side, that'll make up for the 65 amas that are less. So now the Gemara says, Hainu deloidok. That is the point that we're saying that Ula was not precise in the number that he said 16. Ula chumr deloidok, and he's actually being stringent because he's giving a share that's less. He's saying not 16 and a half, but he's saying only 16. That if it'll extend into someone else's property, just 16, you'll be potter. But he didn't mention that other half, which would also make you potter, because he was being more stringent about this. This is the Taich of the Gemara. Here, though, there's a discussion in Rashi and Tosfos that what it says here in the Gemara is the cheshbon that the Gemara makes for a few reasons is also not exactly meduyik. The Gemara here is discussing that Ula was saying a share which is not meduyik with what the Mishnah said, but also what the Gemara over here says is not meduyik, because the Gemara is contrasting the number that Ula says, which is 768, to the number that we learned from the Mishnah, which is 833. The problem is, when we said that number before, 833.3 actually, that was a number for a square. And here, when we say the number by Ula, we're saying 768, which is in a circle, not in a square. So why are we comparing the number of the circle to the square that we said before? That square that we said before should actually be less. If you're going to say that it's really only a circle, it's not going to be 833. It's going to be less than that. I think the number is 816. But it's a lower number, and the Gemara here is ignoring that detail. So Rashi says that the Gemara didn't get into that difference. The Gemara is not being medayik. But there is another gersa in the Gemara. Instead of saying that you have to add a half a amma on each side to make up for the difference between what Ula said and the Mishnah said, there's another gersa Rashi brings. You have to say pashle treitel sadam. So you have to add 2/3 of an amma on each side to make up for that difference, because it's a difference from 816 to 768, which is it comes out different. Okay, if I remember the numbers correctly, this is the simple pshat in the Gemara here. Tashema, Gemara says, I'll bring you a raya from another Mishnah. It says, Akaina Elon, person acquires a tree, just one tree, Vikarkoi, and he acquires also the earth around the tree. Maybe Vikaida, you can bring from that tree the fruits for Bikurim, and you read the psukim for it. You fulfill the mitzvah of Bikurim completely. My love, don't you think that Mishnah means Kol Shuhu? You buy a tree and just a tiny piece of land around it, so it's yours and you can do the mitzvah. So this is a question on Ula that said that you need to have 16 amas around on each side in a circle for the nourishment of the roots, that it should be totally yours to be able to bring the fruits. It says the Gemara Loi, so the Taich of that Mishnah that it says that you bought the karka around it is not just a tiny piece of karka. Yud Vav Amma, you need to have 16 amas on each side. Tashema, there's another Mishnah that says, when you acquire 2 fields, or 2 trees that is, in your the property of your friend, and when the sale was made, no one spoke about what happens to the ground. So over there, the halach is, if you buy only 2 trees, you get the trees, but you have the karka is not yours at all. So therefore, maybe ve'ena kaida, you bring the fruits, but you can't really do the mitzvah fully, so you can't read the psukim because the ground is not yours. So what do we see from this? Hashleisha. But once you buy 3 trees in your friend's property, so now even without specifying, automatically, once you have 3 trees, there's area around those trees that belong to you. The karka belongs to you. And therefore, maybe v'kaira. You bring the bikurim and you can do the mitzvah fully and read the psukim as well. So my lab, don't you think kol shehu, when you buy 3 trees, you get the area of ground around those trees that are yours, it's just a small space. You don't get 16 amas around. So the Gemara says, Loi, hachanami yudvavame. Here as well, once you buy 3 trees, it's an automatic agreement that you get 16 amas of area around it for the nourishment of all the roots, and that's why you can do the mitzvah of bikurim. Tashema, the Gemara brings a raya from another Mishnah, Rabbi Kiva Ime. Rabbi Kiva said, karka kol shehu. And here it spells out very clearly. You have a tiny piece of karka. Chayiv b'peya. The mitzvah of peya applies. That's leaving for the poor people in the corner of your field. Or bikurim, and the mitzvah of bikurim will apply for the trees. And also the kaisun of pruzbul. It's good enough to be able to do the takana of pruzbul. So pruzbul is when it comes to year Shemitah and all loans get absolved. And this is in the time when Shemitah is only midrabanan, which is bisman hazeh. So Chachamim say that you can give over the loan to a bezdin, and then you can collect your loans even after Shemitah passes. And Rashi here says, but pruzbul only applies if you own a piece of karka. And the reason is because if you don't own any piece of karka, that's what's called a milsa d'lei shchicha. Person doesn't lend money to someone that has no assets that he can collect from. So in order for the takana to apply, it has to be a loan where there was an ownership of a piece of karka. Another detail regarding owning a tiny piece of land, there's a kind of kinyan which is called kinyan agav. When I buy a property, along with that property, I can acquire any other movable items. So if you're just buying a tiny piece of property, a kol shehu, along with it, you can acquire other things. So here, in this Mishnah, we clearly see Rabbi Akiva is saying, a karka kol shehu, and there's the mitzvah of bikurim. You don't need the 60 amos around for the nourishment of all the roots. And says the Gemara, hacha b'may askinon b'chiti. One of the shivas aminin that you can bring bikurim from is not just trees, you can bring it from wheat. So wheat doesn't need the roots for the 16 amos around. It's when the Mishnah said a kol shu, it means you have a tiny piece of land where you can plant one stalk of wheat, and that's what you could do the mitzvah bikurim with. The Kanami, I'll prove you that this is the pshat in that Mishnah, the Ktani kol shuhu. The Mishnah says kol shuhu. Even if you're not going to agree to all of that, you need 16 amos around, but a little tiny kol shuhu of a piece of land, how could you plant a tree there? So kol shuhu means that it's with wheat. Shmamino, that's the pshat of that Mishnah. The Gemara brings from another Mishnah, Toshema or a Braise. The Braise says, Elon, what's if you have a tree, miktsase ba'aretz or miktsase b'chutz la'aretz? The tree is right in the border of Eretz Yisrael and Chutz La'aretz. And some of the roots of the tree are in Eretz Yisrael, and some of the roots of the tree are in Chutz La'aretz. So what's the status of the fruits that grow on this tree? Tevel v'chulin v'uraven zebezeh divrei Rebbe. So Rebbe says all the fruits on the tree, it's a mixture. It takes nourishment from inside and outside Eretz Yisrael. So the fruits are tevel, which is the untithed produce, and chulin, and then part of it grows from Chutz La'aretz, which has no obligation to give maises from it. So it's all mixed. So if it's all mixed, you can't really separate maises from it. You can't use it to separate maises for anything else. It's a mixture. Rav Shimon Gamliel says you have to look at the two parts of the tree. Hagadol b'chiyov chayiv. That section of the tree that's facing outside, or actually facing inside, will be chayiv. And hagadol b'ptur potter. You can distinguish. You can see what's inside and what's outside, and therefore you know what's chayiv and what's potter in this tree. That's the machlekes. Says the Gemara, At kanoi pligi. What's the basis of their argument here? Elo demar sovar yesh breire. Rav Shimon Gamliel says that it's possible to clarify, to distinguish what belongs inside and what belongs outside. Umar sovar, and Rebbe says, ein breire. You can't make this distinction in the fruits of a tree where half of the roots are inside Eretz Yisrael and half are outside. That's what they're arguing about. Avol gadol b'ptur divrei hakol potter. However, if you have a tree that's growing right outside the border of Eretz Yisrael, everybody will agree that you're going to be totally potter, even though the roots are extending into Eretz Yisrael. According to what Ola says, roots extend 16 amas. So if you have a tree that's right outside Eretz Yisrael, you can be sure that there are roots that are extending inside Eretz Yisrael. So why shouldn't there be the same issue? That the fruits in your tree are getting nourishment from Eretz Yisrael as well. It seems that in that case, everybody would agree that you're going to be totally potter. And says the Gemara, Hacha b'may askinon. What is this brayso talking about? The mafsik tsunma, that there is a big rock that is separating in this tree. That if this is a tree that's right outside of Eretz Yisrael, the reason why here everybody would agree a potter is because the roots actually are not extending 16 amos into Eretz Yisrael. There's a big large rock that's not allowing the roots to extend into Eretz Yisrael. So the Gemara says, but if that's the case, my time at the Rebbe. If that's the case, then why is Rebbe even arguing here? Because then it must be that the Braisa is speaking about a kind of tree. The Braisa was speaking about a tree that's actually mamish on the border, and half of the roots are inside Eretz Yisrael, and half of the roots are outside Eretz Yisrael. And according to what we're saying, it must be that this is a tree that's basically growing on top of this big rock, and there's half of the roots that are on one side of the rock, outside of Eretz Yisrael, and there's another half of the tree that's on the other side of the rock, inside Eretz Yisrael. So it's pretty clear that it's basically like two trees here. So if so, why would Rebbe say that that the entire tree is considered to be all mixed. Why is it all mixed if there's a rock separating? So the Gemara answers, no, Rebbe can still say that there's a problem here because the Hadri Arvi, because after the roots come out of the ground above that rock, then you have the trunk of the tree, it all becomes back one big tree. So what's the argument here between Rebbe and Reb Shimon ben Gamliel? Mar Savar, Rebbe's opinion is Avira Mevalvel, that the trunk of the tree that's in the airspace above the roots, over there it gets mixed together. Even if in the roots there's a rock that separates them and it's clear that it's two separate trees, but then afterwards in the trunk it becomes mixed back together. But Amar Savar, Reb Shimon ben Gamliel says, Hai l'chudikai v'hai l'chudikai. It's roots that are in two other sides of a rock and therefore they're separate. The fact that later it becomes into one tree, it doesn't. You can distinguish between the fruits on one side and the fruits on the other side. Now the Gemara says, V'sheishes riyama. Here the Gemara asks the question in the reverse, that Ula said the rule regarding the roots of a tree, that they extend 16 amas, not more. But the question is, only 16 amas? V'suloi, do the roots of a tree not extend further than 16 amas? But Vatanan, we learned the Mishnah earlier in this Peirik, you have to distance a tree that you're planting in your property from your neighbor that has a pit. How far? Chafei yama. You have to distance it 25 amas. That's how far the roots extend. So you see here that it goes 25 amas, not 16 amas. Amar Abaye, so Abaye answers, Mezel Tuva Ozli. The roots go further than 16 amas. They go to 25 amas. However, Akhushi loy makhashi ela sheishes riyama. They don't weaken the quality of the soil only up to 16 amas. And that is because the nourishment that the tree is actually drawing from the soil is only 16 amas. The roots grow further than that. And it'll be a problem for a pit that's in the neighboring property. But it's the nourishment that it only takes for 16 amas. So more than that, it doesn't weaken, it doesn't take from the soil of the property. When Rav Dimi came, Omar, he said, Rish Lakish asked from Rabbi Yechanan the same shaila that Ula was speaking about. Ulan hasamach lemetzar b'toich yud vav ame, a tree that's near the border of your neighbor's property and it's within 16 amas. Smahu, could you take the fruits of that tree and do the mitzvah of bikurim? Amalei and Rabbi Yechanan that is answered, Gazlan, he said exactly like Ula, that you're a Gazlan, the roots are taken from your friend, and so you can't bring bikurim. Now, however, there was now another version of what Rabbi Yechanan said. Ki ase Ravin Amar Rabbi Yechanan. Ravin came and he reported that Rabbi Yechanan said differently. Echad ilon asamach lemeitzar. Whether you have a tree that's very close to the border of your friend's property, or whether you have a tree where the branches and the fruits are hanging over into your friend's property, maybe you could bring the fruits and you could do the mitzvah fully and say the psukim. Why? If your tree is hanging over into his property or the roots are going into his property, how could you do the mitzvah? This is one of the conditions that Yeshua made with Yidden. There's a Gemara in another place in Bava Basra. The Gemara says all kinds of conditions that Yeshua made with Yidden when they came into Eretz Yisrael. This was one of the conditions, that there shouldn't be any akpada if the roots are extending into your friend's property, that you have the rights to do that and it's totally yours and you can bring the fruits and do the mitzvah. If you have a tree and the branches of your tree are hanging over into your friend's property, so how far, at what point could your neighbor come and cut off the branches of your tree? So if you have your plow with an ox and you have a mardeya is the goad that you use to guide the ox to go in the right way, and it's high up, it goes high up. So you're allowed to cut off the branches of your neighbor's tree, not to block the goad of your plow. If it's a carob tree or a sycamore tree, which have much thicker branches and much thicker leaves, so over here you can cut off all of the branches. You take a plumb line and you go straight up, and whatever comes into your property, you can cut it all off, all the way up. Beis Hashlachin, if it's a field that's called a Beis Hashlachin. A Beis Hashlachin is a field that needs a lot of water. It doesn't have any canal of water that comes there in that area, and it doesn't rely on rainwater itself. It needs a lot of water in it. So then, Kala Ilan. You could also cut off Kala Ilan Keneged HaMishkailis. You could also cut off all of the branches that are hanging over from your neighbor, because it blocks rain, it blocks the dew coming into the property, so you can cut it all off. Abishal says, Kol Ilon Srak Anytime you have a tree that's empty, that is not a fruit tree, keneged hamishkailis. Those branches that hang over into your property, you can cut it all off with a plumb line, all the way up. You can cut it all off. So now what Abba Shaul here says at the end of the Mishnah. It's not clear if what he said went on the last case of the Mishnah, the case of the Beis HaShlochin, or what Abba Shaul said went on the first case of the Mishnah. So the Gemara will here explain now. The shaila here is Abba Shaul Areishakoi. What Abba Shaul said, what is he saying this regarding what the Tanakama said in the Reisha? The Tanakama says that you could only cut off that amount of branches that are going to be blocking your plowing. It's going to be blocking the goad of your plowing. And on that, Abba Shaul came to add and say that when it comes to a Ilan Srak, you can cut it off all the way up, not only what's blocking your plow. So that's one way to understand Abba Shaul. A Seifa Koi. Or perhaps no, Abba Shaul is actually referring to the Seifa of the Mishnah. The Seifa of the Mishnah was speaking about the Beis HaShlochin. And on that, Abba Shaul is coming to say you can't cut off any tree in the Beis HaShlochin, like the Tanakama said. It's only the Ilan Srak that's not a fruit tree. Only that could you cut off in the Beis HaShlochin. Toshama, so the Gemara brings a clear brayse that says what Abba Shaul's opinion is. The Tanya, the brayse says, Beis HaShlochin, in this kind of field that needs a lot of water, Abba Shaul oimer kol ha'ilan keneged hamishkailis. All trees you can cut off with a plumb line. You can cut off all branches. Mipnei shatzel ra lebeis HaShlochin, because the shade of this of the branches are not good for this kind of property. So Shmamino, so it's clear that Areshakoi. Shmamino, so it's clear that what he was coming to say is that you can cut off all trees, keneged hamishkailis. So that's a clear eye from the lashon of this brayse. Amar Ravashi, and Ravashi says, Masnise nami deke. From the expression of the Mishnah, it's also clear what Abba Shaul meant to say, because the Mishnah says, Kol Ilan Srak. It doesn't just say Ilan Srak. It says, Kol Ilan Srak. Every barren tree. Now, if you're going to say that Abba Shaul was referring to the Reisha, and he's coming to say that you can cut off even more than what the Tanakama said, that's why he uses the term kol. The Tanakama said that it's only the charuv and the shikma, only those kind of trees you can cut it all off, and he's coming to say, no, you can cut off any tree if it's a barren tree. But if you're going to say that he refers to the Seifa, so then he's not coming to add. He's actually coming to say less than the Tanakama. Ilan Srak mi boile, so it should say Ilan Srak, not Kol. He's not coming to add more. So therefore the words of Abba Shaul in our Mishnah is clear that he's coming to add to what the Tanakama said in the Reisha of the Mishnah, that you can cut off all trees. Okay, let's turn to one more Mishnah. Let's finish the Pedic here. A tree that's hanging over into the Rishus Harabim, to the public domain. Kaitzitz, so then they can cut off the branches of this tree, kidei shiye gomel over v'reichvai, so that a camel with a rider on it, which is the high up, he should be able to pass through the Rishus Harabim and not bump into this branch. Rabbi Yehuda says, gomel ta'un pishton oichaviles moiris. A camel that's loaded with flax or with other branches should be able to pass through. Rab Shimon says, Kol ha'ilon keneged hamishkailis. Any branches hanging over into the Rishus Harabim, you don't have to estimate this height that the Tanakama or Rabbi Yehuda said, a camel rider, but you can cut off all of the branches of the tree straight up with a plumb line. Because of the issue of tumah, which the Gemara will explain. Okay, so first the Gemara explains the machlokes of the Tanakama and Rabbi Yehuda, whose shear is higher up. One says a camel and the rider, and the other one says the camel with his package. Who's higher up? First the Gemara is going to discuss another point actually. What the Gemara here is basically saying is, according to the Tanakama and Rabbi Yehuda, you cut off the branches to allow a camel rider to pass through. Now, what's going to happen eventually? You don't cut off the entire tree. You only cut off that he can ride through. But what's going to happen is those branches are going to grow back. So every few months, you're going to have to keep on cutting it again. So now, Man Tane, who is the Tana of our Mishnah that says, the Benizakin, Basar Umdene, the Hashta Azlinan. When you're causing damage, we have to evaluate what is the damage that you're causing right now. And that's the rights that we have to cut off the branches, but not more than that. Reish Lakish says, this is actually a machlokes that we see in another Mishnah. And Rabbi Eliezer here. And what it says in our Mishnah will follow only the opinion of Rabbi Eliezer. Because the Tanya, we learned in the Mishnah, it says later here in this Masechta, Ein oisen cholol tachas reshus harabim. Person can't dig in a reshus harabim beneath, if he's digging from his property into a reshus harabim, and you're making a hollow space under the street. You can't do that. Whether it's beiris, shichin, or midas, whether by digging a pit or a ditch or a cave, which has, these are all things that have covers over them, and you're digging under the street in the reshus harabim. You're not allowed to do that. Why? Because what's if it collapses? And even if you're going to say that what I'm doing right now is safe, but you have to, in the future, one day it may get weak and collapse. So you're not allowed to do that. So the point is, you see, the Tanakama is concerned about the future, even if right now it's safe. Rabbi Eliezer matter. Rabbi Eliezer says, no, it will be allowed. You have to measure it if a wagon filled with rocks, which is extremely heavy, can go over it, and the roof of what you dug under the street is not going to collapse, then you can keep it. It's good. It's okay. So you see here, Rabbi Eliezer says that we estimate what the condition of this is right now. Even if in the future it may deteriorate, but it doesn't matter. Right now you estimate and it's good, so you can dig that here. So the Gemara understands that in our Mishnah, when it says you cut off the branches, and you only cut off to allow a person to go through now, that's good enough. Even if in a few months from now you're going to have to cut off more branches. Rabbi Yechanan says, our Mishnah could follow even the opinion of the Rabbanan. Hassam, there, when a person is digging under the street, there's a reason why the Rabbanan say it's not allowed. Because zimdim de mafches velava daite, because over there, the roof of this hollow area under the street that you dug, it could deteriorate, and you're not even going to notice the deterioration. So it's a real problem. But over here in our Mishnah, the Chachama would agree. Every time the branches will grow more, you're going to have to keep on cutting it. We're not going to obligate you to cut off all the branches right now. Every few months, you're going to have to cut off the branches again. Rabbi Yehuda So the Tanakhama said you have to cut off the branches to allow a camel and its rider to go through. And Rabbi Yehuda says you have to allow the camel and the packages to go through. So here the Gemara asks the Shaila, whose shear is higher? The Shaila was asked, Shiyura de Rabbi Yehuda nafish? Is the shear Rabbi Yehuda gave higher, more? Or is the shear of the Rabbanan nafish? Or is the shear of the Rabbanan higher? Says the Gemara, Pshite, the shiure the Rabbanan nafish. We must say that the shear of the Rabbanan, the camel and the rider, is higher. Because the Yisrael Kedaitach, shiure the Rabbi Yehuda nafish, if the shear that Rabbi Yehuda gives is higher, then Rabbanan mishiure the Rabbi Yehuda hechi avdi. So then, according to the Rabbanan, Rabbi Yehuda says you need space for the package, for the branches to get through. How are Rabbanan going to deal with that? Why shouldn't you be obligated to cut the branches to allow a rider with his packages to go through? So the Gemara says, well, if so, what's with the reverse? You're going to say that the shear of the Rabbanan with a camel and his rider is higher up. So if so, Rabbi Yehuda, b'shir the Rabbanan mayavit. So then how could you say that Rabbi Yehuda's shear is less? Why would he not require to be higher up like the shear of the Rabbanan for the rider to be able to go through? So the Gemara is basically asking, it's hard to understand these two shiurim that the Mishnah says. They're both right. You should have to cut it off both. It should be for the rider to be able to go through and for the packages to go through. And says the Gemara, Rabbi Yehuda says, Efsher the gochin v'cholev to say that if a person is riding on a camel, you have to have the right amount for the packages to go through. But if it's a rider, so then the branches could still go down on the lower down, that this rider will just have to bend down a little bit. He could bend down and he'll be able to make it through. So therefore, according to the Rabbi Yehuda, you don't have to cut the branches because you can still bend down. The last point here that it said in the Mishnah, Rab Shimon Omer, Kol ha'ilon kineged ha'mishkoilis mipnei hatomeh, that if you have any branches of your trees that are hanging over to the Reshus Harabim, you have to cut it all off because of Tumah. Now, what's the Tumah we're talking about here? Taneh. In a Braisa we learned, Mipnei oyel hatomeh. The issue over here is that when you have a tree that's hanging over Reshus Harabim, it formulates a tent. A tent is the halacha of tumah. Anytime you have a dead body that's under a roof, which is a space of a tefach, in this case it's the branches, and if there's a dead body on the ground in the Reshus Harabim, and a kohen is passing through under this oil where there is the branches, so then it's going to make this kohen tameh. So therefore you have to take away these branches that are hanging over, not to cause the tumah of oil that there is here because of the dead body under these branches. That's the pshat of the Mishnah. So the Gemara says, Pshita, isn't it pretty obvious that that's the pshat of the Mishnah? Mipnei hatomet nan. The Mishnah says the reason is tumah. This is the only tumah possible when you have the tumah of oil because of these branches. Says the Gemara, no, there's actually a different shot we could have said. Because imi masnisen, if it was just the language of the Mishnah itself, hava mineh, then I would say, dilme maisi oire v'tume v'shadi. V'shadi hasam. Maybe I would think the pshat in our Mishnah is that because you have these branches hanging over into the Rishus Harabim, what we're concerned of is not the fact that there might be a dead body that's on the ground in the Rishus Harabim, and a kohen passing through will become tamei because he's under the tent of these branches together with the mace that's on the ground. Maybe we would think the problem here is that a raven would come and drop a piece of a dead body on the branches. And now you're traveling below these branches that has a tumah on the branches. And that's also a tumah of oil. If the oil itself is a mace, you also become tameh. And therefore, what I would say is, Visagye b'dachluli, ba'alma. So then it would be enough that all you have to do is, you don't have to cut off all the branches, according to Rab Shimon. What you have to do is you have to thin out those branches, that no raven should be able to drop any dead piece of a body on these branches. It should be thin enough that it would just drop to the ground. Maybe I would think that that's good enough, as long as it's not thick that it can hold a mace above you. Kamash Malon, that's what the Brisa says, that the pshat here is that the problem is that there might be a dead piece of body on the ground, and therefore it formulates an oil over you, and that's what would make you tamei. Adron, Aloch, La Yachber, we shall return to you, the second perek of La Yachber, second perek of, that is, of Bava Basra.